A pilot denies a black woman access to her private jet, only to be instantly fired when she proves it's hers. On a quiet day at an exclusive private jet terminal, one pilot's arrogance led to the mistake of his career. What happens when he denies a passenger access to their own jet simply because of the color of their skin? This isn't just a story about judgment. It's about justice, karma, and a moment that will leave you stunned. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The private jet terminal buzzed with a quiet hum of activity, the kind of serene chaos that only existed in the exclusive world of private air travel. Business tycoons, celebrities, and the ultra-wealthy passed through in their designer suits and sunglasses, their assistants trailing behind with luggage worth more than most people's yearly salaries. Eliza Hayes stepped out of the sleek black car, her modest luggage in hand. Her tailored blazer and silk scarf whispered sophistication, but in this world of ostentation, it wasn't loud enough to scream wealth. She stood tall, her natural curls perfectly styled, and her poise unshaken despite the curious glances she received from the valet staff. "Thank you, Mr. Davies," she said, flashing a warm smile at the driver as he unloaded her bag. "Always a pleasure, Miss Hayes." "Safe travels," he replied, tipping his cap before driving off. Eliza took a deep breath and turned toward the terminal entrance. She wasn't nervous. She never let herself be. But she was aware of the invisible barriers that often rose in places like these. Still, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse. Inside, the air was cooler, laced with the faint scent of polished leather and expensive cologne. Eliza approached the private check-in desk, where a young attendant greeted her with a professional smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass, please?" Eliza handed over the sleek envelope containing her ticket. The attendant scanned it, nodded, and motioned her toward the boarding area. "Thank you, Miss Hayes. The jet is ready for you." "Gate 3, he said, his tone polite but devoid of the reverence she often saw him use with other passengers. Eliza noted it, but let it slide. She adjusted the strap of her handbag and walked toward the gate, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. As she approached, she noticed a man in a crisp pilot's uniform standing near the gate. His posture was rigid, his expression stern, as if he were guarding some sacred treasure. Captain Nash. He was tall, with graying hair and a weathered face that carried the look of someone used to being in charge. His sharp eyes scanned Eliza as she approached, narrowing slightly when they landed on her. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of judgment, before he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "This area is restricted. You might be in the wrong place." Eliza stopped, meeting his gaze with calm composure. "I'm not. I'm here for Gate 3. Captain Nash's eyes flicked to the modest luggage in her hand, and then back to her face, his lips curling into a condescending smile. "I think you might be confused. This gate is for private jet passengers." "I'm aware," Eliza said, her tone steady. "I'm here to board my jet." Captain Nash let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Your jet?" He looked her up and down as though trying to find evidence to support her claim. "And you are?" "Eliza Hayes," she said, her voice unwavering. She held out her boarding pass, but Captain Nash didn't even glance at it. "Look, ma'am," he said, folding his arms. "We have strict protocols here. You can't just walk in." "And I'm not walking in uninvited," Eliza interrupted, her patience thinning. "If you check the flight manifest, you'll see my name." Captain Nash's condescension deep. "I don't need to check anything. People like you don't just own jets. Now, I suggest you leave before I have security escort you out." The words hung in the air, each one a carefully sharpened blade. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, not in shock, but in disappointment. This wasn't new to her, but it still stung. She straightened her spine and fixed Captain Nash with a steady gaze. "People like me?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Captain Nash smirked. "You know what I mean," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. Eliza's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. Instead, she held her ground, her gaze unyielding. "I'd like to speak to your superior," she said calmly. Captain Nash laughed again, louder this time, as though the idea was absurd. "My superior? Lady, I am the superior." The scene began to draw attention. A few nearby passengers and staff glanced over, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Eliza noticed the way they looked at her, some with silent sympathy, others with thinly veiled judgment. But none of them spoke up. She took a step closer to Captain Nash, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're making a mistake," she said. "A big one." Captain Nash's smirk widened. "The only mistake here is you thinking you belong in this terminal." Eliza opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a voice interrupted from behind her. "Excuse me, Miss Hayes?" Eliza turned to see a uniformed crew member hurrying toward her, his expression a mix of urgency and apology. He stopped in front of her, slightly out of breath. "I've been looking for you everywhere," he said, glancing nervously at Captain Nash. "We're ready for you to board." Captain Nash's smirk vanished. "Wait," he said, his voice faltering. "You mean she?" "Yes," the crew member said sharply. "She's the owner of the jet." For the first time, Captain Nash looked at Eliza with something other than disdain. It was a flicker of fear, followed quickly by a sinking realization. Eliza didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The truth was already written across his face. And she wasn't done yet. Eliza stood still, her calm presence a stark contrast to the unfolding chaos around her. The crew member's words had left Captain Nash visibly shaken. His confident smirk had drained into a pale mask of disbelief, his jaw slack, as if his brain couldn't process what he had just heard. "Owner of the jet," Captain Nash repeated, his voice quieter now, tinged with uncertainty. His gaze darted between Eliza and the crew member, desperate for some clarification that might restore the illusion of control he had so arrogantly wielded. The terminal seemed to quiet, as though even the air itself held its breath, waiting for Eliza's next move. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let it stretch, watching as Captain Nash's discomfort grew with every passing second. Her poise was a weapon, one that required no raised voice or grand gestures, only the weight of undeniable truth. The crew member, a young man with neatly pressed attire and a badge that read First Officer Coleman, cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Hayes," he said, addressing Eliza directly this time, "I deeply apologize for the delay and confusion. Your jet has been prepped, and the cabin crew is ready to welcome you aboard." Eliza inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words, but her eyes never left Captain Nash. The captain fidgeted under her gaze, the confidence he had displayed earlier now replaced by a fragile veneer of professionalism. "I see," Eliza said softly, her tone calm but heavy with meaning. She shifted her attention back to Officer Coleman. "Tell me, Officer Coleman, is this how your airline trains its staff to treat clients?" Officer Coleman flushed, clearly caught in an uncomfortable position. "No, ma'am," he said quickly, glancing nervously at Captain Nash. "This is not the standard we uphold. I assure you, this behavior will be addressed." Eliza raised an eyebrow, her expression one of polite skepticism. "Will it?" she asked, her voice measured. She gestured subtly toward Captain Nash without looking at him. "Because I've noticed a pattern. Men like him are often given too many chances to fail upwards. They make these mistakes, and the only people who pay for them are the ones they've wronged." Officer Coleman looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "I understand, ma'am," he said, his voice tight with embarrassment. "I'll make sure this is escalated to management immediately." "Good," Eliza said, her tone final. She turned back to Captain Nash, who had yet to recover his composure. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Eliza stepped closer to him, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She stopped just short of invading his space, close enough that he couldn't ignore her presence, but far enough to maintain her dignity. "You made an assumption about me," she said, her voice low but firm, "based on nothing more than the color of my skin and what you thought I couldn't be. You didn't even bother to look at my boarding pass. You didn't check the manifest. You decided in that moment that I wasn't worthy of being here." Captain Nash swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Eliza interrupted, her voice rising just enough to silence him. "Your protocol allows you to insult and humiliate paying clients? Or does that part only apply to me?" Captain Nash's face flushed an angry red, but he didn't argue. He seemed to sense that any defense he offered would only dig him deeper into the hole he had created. The growing crowd of onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their curiosity now tinged with unease. Some seemed sympathetic, others embarrassed for Captain Nash, but none dared to intervene. Eliza straightened her shoulders, her expression softening slightly as she took a step back. "Do you know what the worst part of this is?" she asked, her tone almost conversational. "It's not the insult. It's not even the humiliation. It's the fact that you thought you could get away with it, that you thought no one would hold you accountable." She let the words sink in, her eyes never leaving his for a moment. The only sound in the terminal was the faint hum of distant engines and the muffled chatter of passengers further away. Then, she turned back to Officer Coleman. "I'll board now," she said, her voice regaining its calm authority. "But I expect a full report on this incident sent to me by the end of the day." "Yes, ma'am," Officer Coleman said quickly, nodding. "Of course." Eliza walked past Captain Nash without another glance, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. As she approached the jet's entrance, the cabin crew lined up to greet her, their smiles a mix of professionalism and genuine warmth. They had clearly been informed of the situation and were eager to make amends. "Welcome aboard, Miss Hayes," said the head flight attendant, bowing slightly. "We've prepared everything to your specifications. Please let us know if there's anything else we can do." Eliza nodded graciously. "Thank you," she said. "I trust everything will run smoothly from here." She stepped onto the jet, the luxurious interior greeting her like an old friend. The polished wood accents, plush leather seats, and soft ambient lighting spoke of understated elegance. It was a space she had designed herself, tailored to her tastes and needs. As she settled into her seat, the tension of the terminal began to fade, but she knew this wasn't over. Justice wasn't just about holding Captain Nash accountable. It was about ensuring that the next person in her position wouldn't have to endure the same treatment. Outside, Captain Nash remained frozen in place, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of consequences pressing down on him, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face them. The gentle hum of the jet's engines vibrated through the cabin as Eliza leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the armrest. The tension from the terminal still clung to her like a faint mist, but the calming ambience of the jet's interior began to dissipate it. She gazed out of the window, watching the tarmac below shimmer under the afternoon sun. Her mind, however, wasn't on the view. Instead, it lingered on the face of Captain Nash, his arrogance, his dismissal, his assumptions. She wasn't angry anymore, not in the way people assumed she would be. Eliza had long ago learned to temper her anger into something more productive, something sharper and far more powerful: resolve. The events at the terminal weren't just about her. They were a reflection of the world she had worked tirelessly to change, a world that often resisted change with all its might. The soft click of a door opening broke her thoughts. She turned her head slightly to see the head flight attendant, a tall woman with a crisp uniform and kind eyes, approach her seat with cautious steps. "Miss Hayes," the attendant said, her tone polite yet uncertain. "May I have a moment of your time?" Eliza nodded, gesturing for her to sit across from her at the small dining table built into the cabin. "Of course," Eliza said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that reminded people she wasn't to be trifled with. The attendant sat down, folding her hands neatly on her lap. "First, I want to extend my sincerest apologies for what happened earlier. Captain Nash's behavior was unacceptable, and I assure you it does not reflect the values of our crew." Eliza studied her for a moment, noting the genuine remorse in her expression. "And yet, it happened," Eliza replied. "Values mean nothing if they aren't enforced." The attendant nodded quickly. "You're absolutely right. I want you to know that we've already contacted our headquarters about the incident. Captain Nash has been relieved of his duties for this flight, and an investigation has been initiated. I was informed to let you know that your concerns are being taken seriously." Eliza raised an eyebrow, her sharp gaze holding the woman in place. "Relieved of his duties?" she echoed. "Is that all?" The attendant hesitated, her confidence faltering under Eliza's scrutiny. "For now, yes," she admitted, "but further actions will depend on the outcome of the investigation." Eliza leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping the table rhythmically. "Tell me something," she said after a moment. "If I hadn't been the owner of this jet, do you think anyone would have investigated at all?" The question hung heavy in the air. The attendant opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find the right words. I can't say for certain," she finally managed, her voice small. Eliza sighed, not out of frustration, but out of the deep weariness that came from fighting the same battle time and time again. That's the problem, she said. Accountability shouldn't depend on someone's status or wealth. It should be a given. The attendant nodded, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. You're right, ma'am. I promise I'll personally ensure that this issue is escalated. Eliza offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. Thank you. I'll hold you to that. The attendant stood, bowing her head slightly. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to let me know. Eliza watched as the woman left, the sound of the cabin door clicking shut behind her. She turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her with an expression that was equal parts determination and exhaustion. In a small office near the terminal, Captain Nash sat stiffly in a metal chair, his hands clasped tightly together on the table before him. Across from him sat a man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable as he reviewed a file on his tablet. Captain Nash's earlier arrogance had dissolved entirely. His palms were clammy, his collar too tight, and his thoughts a chaotic mess. He had been escorted off the flight in front of everyone, his authority stripped from him in an instant. Now, he was left to wait for the consequences he had never imagined would come. The man in the suit finally looked up, his eyes cold and unflinching. Captain Nash, he began, his voice low and measured. Do you understand why you're here? Captain Nash swallowed hard, nodding. Ah, yes, sir. I, may have misjudged a situation at the terminal. Misjudged? The man repeated, his tone sharp. Let's be clear, Captain. You didn't misjudge. You openly discriminated against a passenger based on your own biases. And not just any passenger, the owner of the jet. Captain Nash flinched, the words hitting him like a slap. I wasn't aware of her status, he stammered. If I had known, it shouldn't have mattered. The man interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Her status, her wealth, her position, none of that excuses your behavior. Your job is to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers, not to judge them based on your prejudices. Captain Nash fell silent, his eyes fixed on the table. He knew there was no defense he could offer, no words that could undo the damage he had done. The man in the suit stood, gathering his tablet. Captain Nash, your actions have not only embarrassed this company, but also exposed a deeper issue within our culture. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending further review. Depending on the outcome, your employment may be terminated. Captain Nash's head shot up, panic flashing in his eyes. Terminated? But. No buts, the man said firmly. This isn't just about you. This is about ensuring that what happened today never happens again. With that, the man turned and left, leaving Captain Nash alone in the stark silence of the room. For the first time, Captain Nash felt the full weight of his actions, and the realization crushed him. As the plane ascended into the sky, Eliza felt a sense of calm return to her. She wasn't naive enough to believe that this one incident would change the world, but she knew it would send a message. And sometimes that was enough. She closed her eyes, the gentle hum of the engines lulling her into a quiet resolve. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The jet cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, its engines humming like a lullaby in the background. Eliza sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of clouds below. The soft sunlight filtering through the glass painted her face in golden hues, but her expression remained contemplative, almost distant. She sipped her tea, Earl Grey, brewed to perfection by the attentive flight crew, and let the warm liquid soothe her. Yet, it did little to quiet the thoughts swirling in her mind. The confrontation with Captain Nash played over and over, like an uninvited guest in her head. Every word, every sneer, every condescending glance replayed itself with unrelenting clarity. It wasn't the first time Eliza had encountered prejudice cloaked in arrogance. She had grown up facing microaggressions that escalated into blatant acts of discrimination. But no matter how many times it happened, it never got easier. The weight of it, the sheer audacity of people like Captain Nash to dismiss her existence, always managed to dig deep, scratching at wounds she thought had healed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a light knock at the door of the private cabin. Eliza looked up, her composure quickly returning. "Come in," she said, her voice calm, yet commanding. The door opened to reveal First Officer Coleman, who entered with cautious steps, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. He looked younger than he had seemed earlier, perhaps in his late 20s, with an earnestness that suggested he was still climbing the ranks of his career. "Miss Hayes," he began, standing a few feet away. "I hope I'm not intruding." Eliza gestured toward the seat across from her. "Not at all, Officer Coleman. Please sit." He hesitated for a moment before taking the seat, his posture rigid with a mix of respect and apprehension. "I wanted to follow up on our earlier conversation," he said, clearing his throat. "I've just received confirmation from our headquarters that Captain Nash has been formally suspended pending a full investigation." Eliza nodded slowly, her face unreadable. "And what does that investigation entail?" she asked, her tone neutral but probing. Officer Coleman shifted slightly in his seat, clearly aware of the weight behind her question. "It will involve a review of his actions today, as well as his past performance records. If any similar complaints are found, they'll be factored into the decision regarding his future with the company." "Good," Eliza said, her voice firm but measured. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Officer Coleman's. "And what measures are being taken to ensure this doesn't happen again? It's not enough to deal with one person when the issue runs deeper than that." Officer Coleman seemed taken aback by the directness of her question, but he quickly composed himself. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. Our management team is already discussing mandatory training programs to address unconscious bias and promote diversity awareness across all departments." "Mandatory," Eliza repeated, her lips curving into a faint smile. "That's a start. But programs like that are only effective if they're taken seriously. If they're just a checkbox on someone's to-do list, nothing will change." Officer Coleman nodded, his frown earnest. "I understand, ma'am. I'll make sure to convey that feedback to the management team." Eliza studied him for a moment, her gaze softening slightly. "You're young," she said, her voice gentler now. "You have the chance to shape the culture of this company in a meaningful way. Don't waste it." Officer Coleman blinked, clearly moved by her words. "Thank you, Miss Hayes. I'll do my best," she nodded, dismissing him with a small wave of her hand. Officer Coleman rose, bowing his head slightly before leaving the cabin. The door clicked shut behind him, and Eliza was once again alone with her thoughts. As the plane continued its journey, Eliza found herself drifting back to a memory she rarely allowed herself to revisit. She was 10 years old, standing in a grocery store aisle with her mother. They had been shopping for a birthday cake mix, Eliza bouncing excitedly beside the cart, chattering about the party she was planning with her friends. That had happened. A store clerk had approached them, his face stern and accusatory. "Ma'am," he had said to her mother, "I need to check your bag." Her mother, a proud woman who always carried herself with grace, had frowned in confusion. "Excuse me," she had asked, her tone calm but firm. The clerk had crossed his arms, his gaze flickering to Eliza, then back to her mother. "We've had some complaints," he had said vaguely. "It's just standard procedure." Eliza had watched as her mother opened her bag without argument, her movements slow and deliberate. The clerk had rummaged through it, his expression smug, only to find nothing but a wallet, a set of keys, and a paperback novel. "Thank you," he had said curtly, walking away without so much as an apology. Eliza had looked up at her mother, confused and hurt. "Why did he do that?" she had asked, her young mind struggling to comprehend. Her mother had knelt down to her level, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Because sometimes, baby," she had said softly, "people will judge you before they even know you. But that doesn't define you. Remember that." That moment had stayed with Eliza, shaping her understanding of the world and fueling her determination to succeed despite the obstacles placed in her path. Back in the present, Eliza took another sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle her. She thought about her mother's words and how they had guided her through so many difficult moments. She thought about Captain Nash and the system that had allowed people like him to operate unchecked for so long. This wasn't just about her personal dignity. It was about sending a message that such behavior would no longer be tolerated, not in this company, not on her watch. As the jet began its descent, the clouds parting to reveal the glittering city below, Eliza felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her fight, not just for herself, but for the countless others who faced similar battles every day. And she wasn't going to lose. The jet descended smoothly through the clear afternoon sky, the cityscape below growing larger with each passing moment. The golden sunlight glinted off sky-high scrapers, highways, and the sprawling suburbs, painting the scene in hues of warmth and light. Eliza remained seated by the window, her seat belt securely fastened, her thoughts quiet but resolute. The cabin was silent except for the gentle hum of the engines and the occasional click of a cup or plate being cleared by the attentive crew. Eliza had declined further refreshments, opting instead to sip water from a crystal glass as her mind replayed the events of the day. Each moment with Captain Nash had etched itself into her memory, not just as a personal affront, but as another piece in a larger puzzle she had been trying to solve for years. The intercom buzzed, breaking her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," the new pilot announced, his voice calm and professional. "We'll be landing shortly at Westwood Private Airfield. Local weather is a pleasant 75 degrees, and ground staff are prepared for our arrival. On behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today." Eliza glanced at her watch. Right on schedule. Punctuality was a small but important victory, proof that the incident earlier hadn't disrupted the efficiency she valued so deeply. Yet she knew this trip wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the jet's wheels touched the runway with a smooth, barely perceptible thud, Eliza took a deep breath. The descent was always her least favorite part of flying, not because of the turbulence or the sensation of falling, but because it marked a transition from the controlled stillness of the skies to the often chaotic ground below. The jet taxied toward an exclusive terminal where a small team of staff waited on the tarmac. Through the window, Eliza could see the sleek black car she had arranged for her onward journey, the driver already standing by the rear door. The head flight attendant appeared at her side, her posture impeccable, her demeanor professional yet deferential. "Miss Hayes, we've arrived. May I assist you with your belongings?" Eliza smiled faintly. "Thank you, but I can manage." The attendant nodded and stepped aside, allowing Eliza to gather her things. She reached for her leather carry-on bag, the simplicity of its design belying the significance of its contents: documents, plans, and notes for the meeting she was about to attend. Every item was a testament to her meticulous preparation and her unwavering commitment to excellence. As Eliza stood and made her way to the door, the flight crew lined up to bid her farewell. Each one offered a polite nod or a quiet, "Thank you, Miss Hayes," their expressions a mixture of respect and relief. Eliza returned their gestures with a gracious nod, her heels clicking softly against the cabin floor. The moment she stepped out of the jet, the warm breeze greeted her, carrying with it the faint scent of jet fuel and freshly cut grass from the nearby field. She descended the short flight of steps, her movements deliberate, her gaze steady. The driver approached, opening the car door with a slight bow of his head. "Welcome back, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "Thank you," Eliza replied, sliding into the car with practiced ease. As the door closed behind her, sealing her into the quiet luxury of the vehicle, Eliza allowed herself a moment to relax. The leather seat molded to her form, the hum of the engine a soothing counterpoint to the noise of the day. The car pulled away from the airfield, merging onto a private road that cut through the outskirts of the city. Eliza watched the scenery blur past, manicured lawns, tall gates guarding sprawling estates, and the occasional glimpse of the city skyline in the distance. She thought back to the head flight attendant's words earlier. "Captain Nash has been suspended pending investigation." It was a start, but Eliza knew better than to celebrate prematurely. She had seen too many investigations that led nowhere, too many suspensions that ended with quiet reinstatements. The cycle of accountability often stopped short, leaving the root issues untouched. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. Eliza reached for it, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her assistant, Simone, who had stayed behind to coordinate the fallout from the incident. "Simone, HQ confirms Nash suspension. Management wants to schedule a call with you to discuss next steps. Let me know when you're free." Eliza sighed and typed a quick reply. "Eliza, tomorrow morning. I want a full briefing on their proposed actions before the call. Details matter." She put the phone away, her mind already shifting to the meeting she was on her way to. This wasn't just a personal trip, it was a professional one, tied to her broader mission of creating opportunities and dismantling barriers in industries that had long resisted change. The car arrived at its destination, a sleek, modern office building with glass walls that reflected the afternoon sun. Eliza stepped out, adjusting her blazer as she took in the sight before her. This was where decisions were made, where power was wielded, and she intended to ensure that her voice would be heard. Inside, a receptionist greeted her with a smile. "Welcome, Miss Hayes. The boardroom is ready for you." Eliza nodded, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor as she walked toward the elevator. Each step was a reminder of why she was here, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been dismissed, underestimated, or mistreated. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Eliza straightened her posture, her reflection staring back at her in the mirrored walls. She saw not just herself, but the countless faces of those who had inspired her journey, her mother, her younger self, and even the strangers she had yet to meet. All of them deserved better, and Eliza was determined to make it happen. The elevator ascended with a faint hum, the numbers on the digital panel changing in steady succession. Eliza stood still, her hands lightly clasped in front of her, her posture flawless. She glanced at her reflection in the mirrored walls, a composed figure dressed in an immaculate tailored suit, her natural curls framing a face that betrayed no sign of the turbulence she had encountered earlier in the day. The bell chimed softly as the elevator slowed to a stop. The doors opened to reveal a wide, marble-floored hallway that led to a pair of frosted glass doors. Etched into the glass was the name of the firm, Brightline Aviation Group. Eliza took a deep breath and stepped forward, each click of her heels echoing faintly in the quiet corridor. The receptionist behind the sleek mahogany desk rose to greet her as she approached. "Good afternoon, Miss Hayes," she said, her tone warm but professional. "The board is assembled and waiting for you in the main conference room." Eliza inclined her head slightly. "Thank you." The receptionist gestured toward the large doors at the end of the hallway. "Right this way." Eliza entered the boardroom with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to commanding attention without demanding it. The room was spacious and modern, dominated by a long glass table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline, the sunlight casting angular patterns across the polished floor. The members of the board, 7 men and 3 women, stood as she entered, their murmured conversations halting mid-sentence. Their expressions ranged from polite curiosity to barely concealed apprehension. Eliza noticed every flicker of hesitation, every glance exchanged between them. She was used to these moments, the silent calculations that occurred whenever she walked into a room like this. "Miss Hayes," said Arthur Sterling, the chairman of the board, stepping forward with a practiced smile. He was an older man, his silver hair neatly combed, his bespoke suit tailored to perfection. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice." "Thank you for accommodating me," Eliza replied, her voice even. She shook his hand briefly, then took the seat he indicated at the head of the table. As she settled into the chair, the rest of the board followed suit, their movements almost synchronized. A thin stack of papers sat before her, briefing materials she assumed, but Eliza didn't touch them. She didn't need to. She already knew why she was here and what needed to be addressed. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, glancing around the table before speaking. "Before we begin, I want to extend the board's apologies for the incident you experienced earlier today. Captain Nash's behavior was unacceptable and does not reflect the values of Brightline Aviation." Eliza tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. "I appreciate the sentiment," she said, her tone measured. "But words alone won't resolve what happened." Mr. Sterling nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Of course. That's why we've already initiated an internal investigation. Captain Nash has been suspended pending the outcome, and we're reviewing his past performance to determine if this behavior is part of a larger pattern." Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what about the systemic issues that allowed this to happen in the first place?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting. "This isn't just about one individual's actions. It's about the culture within your organization that made him feel comfortable acting that way." There was a brief silence, the weight of her words settling over the room. A few of the board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard by her directness. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat again, shifting slightly in his seat. "You raise a valid point, Miss Hayes," he said. "We've already begun discussions about implementing new training programs to address unconscious bias and promote inclusivity across all levels of the company." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Discussions?" she repeated. "With respect, Mr. Sterling, discussions aren't enough. This requires action. Concrete, measurable action." Eliza leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table. "Here's what I propose," she began, her tone steady. "First, mandatory bias training for all employees, not just frontline staff. That includes executives, board members, and pilots. Second, a review of your hiring and promotion practices to ensure diversity at all levels. Third, the establishment of an independent oversight committee to handle complaints and hold individuals accountable. The room fell silent again, the board members clearly processing the scope of her proposal. Mr. Sterling's expression was carefully controlled, but Eliza could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Those are ambitious steps," he said cautiously. "Implementing them will require significant resources and time." "Necessary resources and time," Eliza countered. "If Brightline Aviation wants to position itself as a leader in the industry, it can't afford to ignore these issues. You've already seen the consequences of complacency. Today's incident is a stain on your reputation, and it won't be the last unless you take meaningful action." Mr. Sterling exhaled slowly, glancing around the table. "What does the rest of the board think?" he asked. One by one, the members began to speak, their voices ranging from cautious agreement to outright enthusiasm. Eliza listened carefully, her sharp gaze shifting between them, noting who spoke with conviction and who merely echoed others. When the discussion finally paused, Eliza spoke again, her voice quieter but no less powerful. "I didn't come here today just as the owner of a jet," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "I came here as someone who has experienced the kind of bias your employees displayed. I've fought to overcome those barriers my entire life, and I've succeeded not because of the system, but in spite of it." Her words hung heavy in the air, the room utterly silent. Even Mr. Sterling seemed at a loss for words, his normally smooth demeanor faltering slightly. Eliza straightened in her seat, her expression unyielding. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who walks through your doors and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. If Brightline Aviation wants to be better, it starts here." Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "You've made your point, Miss Hayes," he said, "and I believe the board is in agreement. We'll take your proposals under serious consideration and begin outlining an actionable plan." Eliza inclined her head slightly. "Good," she said. "I'll expect a timeline and progress updates within the month." The meeting concluded soon after, the board members rising to shake her hand before departing. Mr. Sterling lingered, watching as Eliza gathered her things. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Hayes," he said finally. "I hope you know that." Eliza smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. "I do," she replied, her tone quiet but firm. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor. As she stepped into the waiting car, the weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a sense of quiet determination. This wasn't the end of the battle, it was only the beginning. But Eliza Hayes was no stranger to beginnings. She knew how to turn them into victories. The soft hum of the car's engine filled the silence as Eliza gazed out of the tinted window. The city seemed to blur into streaks of light and motion, yet her mind was sharper than ever. The meeting had gone as she expected, measured agreement laced with hesitation. Change, she had learned, was never comfortable. It was messy, disruptive, and met with resistance. But it was also necessary. The driver, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. He had driven for her on numerous occasions and knew better than to interrupt her thoughts. But today, there was something in his gaze, a quiet curiosity, perhaps even admiration. "Miss Hayes," he ventured carefully, his voice steady. "If I may say so, the way you carry yourself, it's inspiring." Eliza turned her attention to him, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Barlow," she said, her tone sincere. "But it's not just about me. It's about the work. That's what matters." He nodded, his eyes returning to the road. "Still," he added, "it takes courage to stand up to people who think they're untouchable." Eliza didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let his words settle over her. Courage. It was a word often attributed to her, but it wasn't something she thought about often. To her, standing up wasn't about bravery. It was about necessity. There was no alternative. The car slowed as it approached a small cafe on a quiet street lined with oak trees. Eliza glanced at the familiar storefront, its awning a cheerful shade of green, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Would you mind waiting for a moment, Mr. Barlow?" she asked. "Not at all, ma'am," he replied, pulling the car to a stop. Eliza stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she walked toward the cafe. Inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods enveloped her, a comforting contrast to the corporate sterility of the boardroom. The cafe owner, a middle-aged woman named Clara, looked up from behind the counter, her face lighting up when she saw Eliza. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customer," Clara exclaimed, her warm smile creasing the corners of her eyes. "Hi, Clara," Eliza said, returning the smile. "Just a quick stop today. How's business?" "Busy as ever," Clara replied, already reaching for the ceramic cup she reserved specifically for Eliza. "The usual?" "Of course." As Clara prepared her tea, Eliza took a moment to look around. The cafe was modest but full of life. A couple whispering over their drinks in the corner, a student hunched over a laptop, and a young family sharing a plate of pastries. It was a world away from the sterile luxury of private jets and boardrooms, yet it was here, in places like this, that Eliza often found clarity. Clara set the cup on the counter with a gentle clink. "Here you go, darling," she said. "On the house today." Eliza raised an eyebrow, reaching for her wallet. "Clara, you know I don't do free. And I know you're about to tell me not to argue with you," Clara said, laughing. "Fine. Just promise me you'll sit for a minute and enjoy it." Eliza chuckled softly, sliding a bill across the counter. "Deal." Eliza sat by the window, the warm cup cradled in her hands. The sunlight streaming through the glass cast a soft glow on her features, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply be. The day had been long, and the weight of her responsibilities often felt overwhelming. But here, in the quiet hum of the cafe, she found a rare sense of peace. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her back to reality. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her assistant, Simone. "Simone, preliminary report from HQ attached. They're requesting your feedback before finalizing. No rush. Enjoy your evening." Eliza sighed softly and set the phone aside. The fight for change wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. And while she was prepared to go the distance, she knew the importance of pacing herself. She took another sip of her tea, savoring its warmth, and let her gaze drift to the world outside the window. The street was quiet, the golden light of the setting sun painting everything in shades of amber. It was a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, there was beauty to be found. When Eliza returned to the car, Mr. Barlow opened the door for her with a slight nod. "All set, ma'am?" he asked. "All set," she replied, sliding into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, Eliza glanced at her phone again. The report from Simone could wait until she was home. For now, she allowed herself to simply watch the world go by, her thoughts drifting between the challenges ahead and the quiet victory she had already claimed. This wasn't the end of the story, it was merely a chapter. And Eliza Hayes knew better than anyone that the best stories were built one chapter at a time. The car rolled to a stop in front of Eliza's townhouse, a modern yet unassuming structure nestled in the heart of the city. The evening light bathed the facade in a soft glow, casting long shadows on the cobblestone path leading to her door. Mr. Barlow stepped out to open her door, and Eliza thanked him with a nod as she gathered her bag. "Good night, Mr. Barlow," she said, pausing briefly. "Good night, Miss Hayes," he replied, tipping his cap. "And as always, it was an honor." Eliza offered a faint smile before turning toward her door. The keypad beeped softly as she entered her code, and the lock clicked open. Inside, the house greeted her with its familiar calm. Minimalist decor, warm lighting, and the faint scent of lavender from a nearby diffuser. It was a space she had designed for solace, a refuge from the demands of her world. She set her bag on the entryway table and slipped off her heels, exchanging them for a pair of comfortable flats. The weight of the day began to lift as she moved through the house, her steps light but deliberate. She poured herself a glass of water in the kitchen and carried it to her favorite spot, a reading nook by the window where she could see the city lights twinkling in the distance. Eliza sat down, letting the stillness of the moment envelop her. She pulled out her phone and opened the report Simone had sent earlier. As she read through the details, a sense of satisfaction began to take root. The proposed changes weren't perfect, but they were a start. Mandatory training sessions, revisions to hiring policies, and the formation of an oversight committee. It was progress, and progress was what she had fought for. She set the phone aside and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. Today had been a battle, but it wasn't the war. There would be more moments like this, more challenges to face, and more systems to dismantle. Eliza knew that her work was far from over, but she also knew that she was capable of meeting every challenge head-on. As the night deepened, Eliza reached for her journal, a small leather-bound book she rarely shared with anyone. She flipped to a blank page and began to write, her pen moving fluidly across the paper. Today reminded me of why I started this journey. Change doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come quickly, but every step matters. Every small victory builds towards something larger. Captain Nash was just one man, but he represents a mindset that has lingered for too long. If I can help shift that mindset, even slightly, then today was worth it. She paused, tapping the pen against the edge of the book. There's still so much to do, and sometimes it feels overwhelming. But I think of Mom. I think of what she endured and how she taught me to rise above it. Her strength is my strength. And as long as I remember that, I know I'll be okay. Eliza set the journal aside and gazed out at the city. The lights seemed brighter tonight, as if reflecting her quiet determination. She finished her water and stood, stretching slightly before heading upstairs. In her bedroom, she changed into a soft robe and sat on the edge of her bed. The events of the day replayed in her mind one last time, but this time, they didn't feel heavy. They felt purposeful. She reached for the lamp and turned it off, the room plunging into darkness. As she lay down, the city's distant hum lulled her into a peaceful sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new victories. Eliza Hayes was ready for all of it, because she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had been underestimated, dismissed, or judged. And as long as she had the strength to fight, she wouldn't stop. This was only the beginning. And so, the pilot learned the hard way that arrogance and prejudice have no place in a world that demands accountability. Eliza's calm strength and unwavering resolve didn't just expose his ignorance. They set a precedent for justice and dignity. If this story inspired you or made you think, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us share more stories that challenge perspectives and spark important conversations. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.